little bit late. It's another late night. It's a Friday. I figured, hey, why not? Let's make it really, really late. Inconveniently late for everybody. I'm a night owl, though. I'm a night owl, so this is a perfect time, and I hope it's a perfect time for you. This is PaleocratDiaries. Ow! Come on. We gotta rock. We gotta be pumped up. And why is that? Because we're talking St. Bonaventure. And it's perfect timing, isn't it? Happy feast day, by the way. Super pumped about that. The timing, it was not even intentional. And it's gonna be a fantastic show. We're gonna continue. This is a slight detour in our conversation about presuppositional apologetics. Colin Causey, fantastic article. I began that in the last one. Today we're gonna be talking a little bit about this right here, and by a little bit we're gonna go through the whole thing. Bonaventure's critique of Thomas Aquinas. It's true. That's what we're gonna do, because not to diminish, but to show that rivalry and say, look, these things can inform each other. It's a perfect time, a perfect place, in fact, because Colin is Thomistic, and there's going to be a correction coming up. It's been a week for that, hasn't it? A little bit of mea culpas, a little bit, but you got to be able to do that if you want to make strides, and the empire, it's expanding. It's expanding all the time. And why is that? Because it's a collective effort. And we do that by taking a knee for Christ the King, resolving deep inside to give everything we've got, right? We are going to commit every thought, every word, every deed to the advancement of the kingdom, because he's on the throne right now. He's on the throne right now. All power in heaven and on earth is his. So what do? Never give up, keep on smiling, and remember, we too, we're gonna die. We don't know when either. So we got to dream bigger thoughts. And part of the apostolate here is evangelizing the world, taking it all under Christ the King. And we're doing it with a little bit of apologetics. A little bit. And I don't want to get lost in the ramble of this either, in a couple ways, right? Because we're doing some awesome stuff over here, aren't we? It's true. I mean, it's like leaps and bounds, right? The onward and upward trajectory of this. I'll go ahead, I'll take these buggers off. I love them, but it's pretty dark in here actually today. So I'm going to take them things off. Put my glasses on. So, leaps and bounds, onward and upward. And part of that is that we've been very open to just the reality that claims that we're making about methodology, that we're trying to crank up this thing that is going to result in a genuine dialogue in the Catholic apologetic community regarding methodology. I don't have all the answers for that. I'm a guy, right? I was talking yesterday. I had the privilege, in fact, of talking to Dr. Feingold. Awesome guy. We talked about Hebraic roots and other things, church authority. Jake Fowler and I, we had a conversation with him, and it was amazing. The guy's an awesome guy, and nothing but respect for him. But in that conversation, we were asking questions. What's a theologian? We were learning. What does it amount to now? Maybe it was easier back in the day. Maybe it was easier. But I've never considered myself that, and rightfully so. I'm looking into things like master's degrees right now to say, I've studied this stuff for years, most of my life, and I'm a real weirdo, I'm one of those guys that for a long time, and I went to seminary as a Protestant for a short time, but I never completed that master's degree. And so I take it as a position that says, and I've said this before, that I am an icebreaker, the boat that cracks through those huge sheets of ice. And you have to be tough. You got to be the kind of person that's going to do that, because you're going to get all beat up, and you got to be down with that. It's kind of messed up a little. And so I say, well, I'm fit for that. But the idea is to bring in the supply ships, and those supply ships are going to be people much brighter than I am, that are going to be able to put these things together in a way that is going to be truly robust, rising up to the occasion of the modern age that we're enduring right now, with the sickness of nihilism all around us, with all of the things that come along with that, right? The skepticism, the relativism, the solipsism. And so to recognize that and say, I play a role, I'd like to do more, but I understand the procedure of that. And part of that is reaching out to other people and saying, help me out. If we can make this even better, if I've used things before, certain words before in a way that was loose. Like, for example, saying explicit, right? And not fully appreciating how the way that word can be understood when talking about the knowledge that we have of God. And so to be able to talk to people and say, look, okay, that makes sense to me. I misspoke. I should have said it differently, right? Even the way that I've spoken of other people in the apologetics community, I would love to get their attention. I would, because I think that this topic deserves that attention. And I think that there are people that are already right now, they're already engaged in all of these different fields all over the place. And whether it's conversations that we're going to talk about today, right? This conversation, whether it's about Trinitarian ontology, right? That kind of a thing. These conversations, these investigations, and the research required for those things are being done by folks who can run circles around me. And there's no sense of pride in me that's like, oh, I don't think so. No. I definitely think so. I definitely think so. So I take it as an honor, in fact, and a privilege to be able to talk to other people who are better equipped than I am on these things. And sometimes I was telling my wife yesterday, sometimes I feel like that I miss the trees for the forest. Man, I got a piece of hair or something stuck in my mouth. That's going to annoy me, man. So the thing is, like, I miss the trees for the forest, right? I see bigger pictures sometimes, right? I see that. But really sometimes it's the smaller things. It's those more minute details. It's I can look at a system where, I'm watching as people are debating and they're doing the rap battle. They're going verse for verse, tit for tat, back and forth till they're blue in the face. And the entire time I'm looking at that thing like a speed reader does at paragraphs. And I'm saying, this is a structure. There's a foundation. That foundation, is it okay? No, that's on sinking sand. Where is it? Well, they lack the cornerstone. It's falling apart. There's no mortar, just a bunch of bricks. And people are debating over if that brick fits, if that brick and that brick. And I'm like, blow the house down. Blow it down. Right? So I'm one of those guys that does that. But on the other hand, we need those other people who are exceptional at the fine-tuned dynamics of the system. And sometimes in my effort, I've kind of deprioritized that. And to my own detriment, in fact. It's one of those things that in an effort to try to blast through a bunch of ice, you've ended up creating issues that you didn't need to create. It didn't need to happen that way, but it did. Okay? So we're gonna just go right in. We're gonna do it real quick. I'm sorry for that rather long introduction. We'll get to the comments here in a second. Just to say hi, we're running late, so we're gonna rock and roll. Real quick though, we're gonna have a word from our sponsor, from SAINTMAKER. If you have not gotten SAINTMAKER, you got to do it for all the reasons that I'm about to say. Can a personal planner really make you a saint? Not by itself. But in our day and age of addictive apps and glowing screens, we're bombarded by constant distraction, and our quest for sainthood often takes a backseat. The SAINTMAKER is the first high-performance planner for the spiritual life, made by faithful Catholics for faithful Catholics. It's a work of genius, really, fusing the wisdom of the saints with the science of personal productivity. It's rigorous, but sainthood is tough, and most of us need help organizing our time, our work, our leisure, and our devotion, because that can help you become a saint. The SAINTMAKER is elegant, fits in your purse or briefcase, and is a perfect companion for your missal, Bible, or rosary. Published 4 times per year, each season includes daily planning pages, feast days, and devotions for both forms of the liturgical calendar, goal-setting pages, confession journals, and more. It's why the SAINTMAKER is used by hardworking Catholics, like CEO of Sock Religious Scott Williams, best-selling author Sam Guzman, YouTubers like Amber Schneider, a Catholic wife Dina Barca and Brian Holdsworth, and priests like Father Corey Stitcha. Try the SAINTMAKER out, and if you decide that it's not for you, you can send it back for a full refund within 90 days. So go right now. Find your life planner at thesaintmaker.com. Quantities are limited though, so head on over to thesaintmaker.com to order yours and to start your SAINTMAKER journey today. Hit it up right now. It's going to be totally awesome over at the SAINTMAKER.com/PaleocratDiaries. You got to do it. Let's see here. Hold on. There we go. That's the sound. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. My son, Ambrose, bringing me some goods, some things that I absolutely need. Definitely. Thank you very much. Yeah. All right. So you got to rock out, everybody. You got to rock out. You got to hurry up and you got to grab that big box of carrier pigeons to let everybody know, friends, family, co-workers, classmates, frenemies, all the gang, even the folks that aren't your frenemies, straight up enemies, and say, look, you've got to tune in because we are going to enter the octagon of history. We're going to be double doozy in this bugger, right? I was almost going to triple doozy this. I was almost going to talk about the introduction to Caritas in Primo. I bought the book today, by the way. Dr. Jared Goff. Super psyched about that. Isaac Jared Goff. I need to have that guy on the show. The guy's a genius. He's going to spin me like a dreidel, though. I'm going to be like, I don't know what you just said. It sounds great, though. And we're going to be talking a little bit, just a little easy, right? Continuing the progress we're making on the presuppositional apologetics Reformed Catholic approaches. And that's by Colin Causey. And of course, right here, this article, Bonaventure's Critique, Thomas Aquinas, by Brennan Case over at Church Life Journal, a journal of the McGrath Institute for Church Life. So you got to go right now, right? We got to take a knee. We got to resolve that no matter what, we're committed. We're committed to learning more, to growing stronger all the time, to moving forward with no fear and no shame, because the world is desperately relying, in fact, on you, insofar as you are advancing the light, the life, and the love of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's what it's about. And so resolve in your heart, say, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep on smiling no matter what. It's wicked bad. But that's not going to take the joy out of my heart. And to know deep inside that one day you're going to die. You are going to die and you don't know when. So you need to make the best of it right now. You need to give it everything, commit right now to moving forward with that dream that God's placed inside of you, and you can flesh that out in gifts and talents. Giving it to Him all the way, 100%. That's what you got to do. And that's what we're doing here. Yeah, we're doing it together. We're doing it in the Wolfpack too, and if you're not part of the Wolfpack, I really do encourage you to, with great haste, in fact, to become part of that. There's no reason, right? There's no reason for you not to. It's kind of absurd if you're not already there. I'm a little bit offended. Speaking of people who do not offend me, for the most part, every once in a while, people are like, oh, I've seen you get offended, Paleocrat. I've seen you get offended, homie. And I'm like, I know. Sometimes it happens. Every once in a while, little bits. I was offended today because, they made some pizza at the house. I'm doing the Fat Shame for Fitness. I don't know if you've recognized this. I actually have a jawline. I don't have big old, jowls like some kind of bulldog anymore. I've lost about 20 pounds eating food like this, in fact. I've got Dorito chips and I've got this fried chicken sandwich. That's right. I'm losing weight like crazy eating this way and doing a good job. So if you want to know more about that, how you can lose weight and keep it off and pray more than you've ever prayed before, and you want to know how is Paleocrat doing that? How is he looking so mega dope with that chiseled jawline and chin? All you got to do, you got to just reach out to me on Telegram, link in the description below. Simple, T, like the letter T, .me/TheWolfpack chat. Just go and join that. It's entirely for free. Make sure to mute it or you're going to have like 1,000 notifications in a day. And then just reach out to me privately. You can reach out to me in a DM, video call, voice call, anything. I'm always accessible in that way. And so we have a private chat and we do multiple sessions. We actually just did our 10th one. And so that was totally awesome. So, okay. Right here, let's see here. Blessed Feast of St. Bonaventure. Better believe it, son. Better believe it. Isn't the timing remarkable? It just came out that way. It wasn't even one of those things. I feel badly because I didn't mention, the guitars and the guitars and all that. I hope that everybody took the initiative and did that anyway. And broke out your guitars and your sitars and your flutes and your lutes and everything else. And we're letting the world know that you're super pumped up for the Lord. John says, our priest today told how the Pope asked Saints Thomas and Bonaventure to compose a hymn for Corpus Christi. Hearing what St. Thomas composed, Bonaventure tore up his own work. Yes, totally, yeah. And I'll tell you, it was one of those things where, yes, it was a rivalry, but you almost got to imagine, I mean, they're only 4 years difference. You know what I mean? Like, so, I mean, you're talking like a senior in high school and a freshman. That's ultimately what you're doing. And that the freshman's Mr. Smarty Pants. And the senior, right, that once they get older, they're in the same institution. And you almost have to imagine, they're kind of arguing around the lunch table or something. And that these conversations are fleshing themselves out even in their written literature. It's amazing. But the humility involved as well. They're what would it be? The angelic doctor and the seraphic doctor? Or the seraphic? I don't know how you'd pronounce that. But yeah, about seraphim, and in that everybody, and you both of those are angels. Both of those are angels. Okay. And so the dignity of both of those and the traditions, the way that they can inform what we are doing now in this modern world, I think we need the power of both of them. That's my position. I think we need the power of both. Just like I think we need the power of continuing to do natural theology and classical apologetics and understanding that we live in a time where those presuppositions, which may or may not have been challenged and may or may not have deviated before, those things are just out of control at this point. Out of control. And that it's necessary, in fact, to deal with those things, that we ought to, it's most fitting for the situation that we're in. I'm a both and kind of guy. Why make an either or out of a good both and? And in this case, angels and seraphim, yeah, I think we're good with the both and. Let's see. Yeah, Thomas Westlaw says louder. Do I need to get louder for real? I said louder. Yeah, well, I can do that, buddy. I can do that. Byzantine Scotus again says that's a great article. By the way, if you have not familiarized yourself with Church Life Journal, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, or Brendan Case, or, of course, my boy, Byzantine Scotus, or or any of the others, Colin Causey, right? And that's it, the Catholic Areopagus. You can find his blog over there. He wrote a very long essay. It's about 32 pages printed out. We're going through that. And, of course, Dr. Isaac Jared Goff. And amazing guy. And so make sure to check all of them out. Those are people whose work has been tremendously influential on my life and on my apologetic. So I'm grateful for all of them. And look at all these people I'm grateful for. Look at all that. You see this? Let's see. We need to do a roundtable discussion with Goff. Yes, we do. We've been threatening that for a while. We need to actually really do it for realsies. Let's see. Thomas and Bonaventure died within months of each other, too. I really want a buddy movie about them. Dude, wouldn't that be great? We got to have it, man. We've got to have it, Tiger said, I witnessed the sun moving around the motionless earth as usual. Today you did. Okay. All right, Tiger Bear. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. Let's see. Scotus and St. Francis and St. Dominic exchanging cinctures, true bro moment. Yeah. All right. Yeah, Colin's in there too. So if you want to ask questions to Colin about his article, if you'd like to talk to Byzantine Scotus, dude, it's awesome. I got to say, it's pretty awesome, man, to be in a chat and to recognize this is a testament, I think, right? This is a testament to the show as fragile, right? As the message is, right, going out there and me giving my darndest. I'm just one guy. But I've recognized with the empire expanding as it is, I have realized that it needs to involve more. And actually, Colin's one of those guys that was like, look, he has a background in fields that I do not. And so when I talk, I have a certain, I grew up on talk radio. I did talk radio most of my life. Okay. I went to school for journalism and mass comm. I have my degree in that as a media theorist and a media ecologist. So that's a main point of emphasis for me. But the medium that I chose was radio, right? Rather than newspapers and stuff like that. But I took what I was trained in regarding traditional, right? A more traditional understanding of journalistic integrity and research in approaching topics, not just that I was talking about, like, and writing about for stories, but also to almost anything I was doing. It was a journalistic impulse of mine. And in that way, I've researched apologetics. I went to school, of course, for presuppositional apologetics for a short time at Bonson Theological Seminary. Had a baby, though, but connecting with people like this who for all the deficiencies and insufficiencies of this program, for all of them, admittedly so, they still find something valuable about it. They find something valuable about the effort. Maybe it's that it's valiant, right? It's the underdog moment. Maybe it's because there's something to this. There's something even within their system that they say, I've had an inkling of this. Maybe even an intuition. You know what I mean? Like a Bonaventurean styled one, right? And to say, there's something about this that seems to be fitting for recalibrating apologetics to the moment. And that there's been enough talk of toward a new apologetic. There's been enough talk as to the reasons why we need to recalibrate, including Knox's notion and his fear that the underlying assumptions, the presuppositions, the Catholic presuppositions that had dominated in the West for so long, that those were not only under attack, but he had enough foresight to see what was coming. And he said, he went so far as to say, we need to lump the traditional proofs for God's existence, the classical proofs, we need to lump them down to one that all the other ones presuppose. I take that as saying he recognizes in multiple ways the need to get back and to secure the most basic and ruling presuppositions that for a long time had been taken for granted. Which is what that's normal, right? For presuppositions. That's normal because they're presupposed. So they're taken for granted. They're subtle and sly, in fact. I want to clarify something as a preface to this. So the last episode I was going through and I admitted that I was bungling things up. I said, I'm probably bungling this because I'm so accustomed. I'm on the show by myself and I'm reading something and I said I was chomping at the bit. There were, bringing up things about arguments made against presuppositionalism that were just, in my opinion, grotesquely unfair. In the process of engaging with that and doing an analysis of Collins' essay, I reached a place in it where he talked about an argument, the second horn of Trent Horn's argument against presuppositionalism. And he goes through and he says, it's clear that this argument is aimed against natural theology. Consequently, Catholic presuppositionalists will reject it. I would say Catholic presuppositionalists of the Thomistic brand, but not of mine. That it's one of those that I said, I don't know if I would reject this because I don't believe that natural theology is on the block. I don't believe that it's got its neck on the chopping block with that. Otherwise, you'd have, it wouldn't even be like, should I or whatever. I'd say, oh, no, you can't. You can't do that. Yeah. And then he addresses later, and the confusion came up because going down further, he begins talking about the answers and responses that presuppositional people would have, including myself, which I base some of those off of stuff that I think was succinctly put together in this. And so I encourage you, go and look at his article or his essay and read that. Okay, I think it's also in the description. If it's not, if somebody could please put it in the live chat, that'd be really helpful. And to read it from a more Thomistic perspective, because I anticipate, and it's already happening right now, I anticipate that people from various different schools, right? People who might emphasize Bonaventure over, let's say, even the development within Scotus, right? To say some people may emphasize that dynamic. Some people, the transcendentals in that way. Some people might emphasize Thomas and the way that he understands those things that we're going to talk about tonight. And some of us, like myself, may be among those who proudly wear the badge of honor that we refer to as the new Bonaventurians. I think it just sounds so dope, doesn't it? The Bonaventurians. I mean, come on, it's branding genius, by the way. Good luck, guys. Good luck with that. So, okay, Bonaventure's critique of Thomas Aquinas, and we'll go through, because part of it is that it's unnecessary. I think part of this is unnecessary, that we even have to go this route to try to be like, well, no, this is in opposition to Thomas, and we've got to really explain this. And we'll talk about that in a future episode on another article that's written by someone else that has to do, it could have been aptly named, Will the Real Thomism Please Stand Up? And it's talking about the myriad ways that people interpret Thomas, and the various ways that some Thomists have come against other Thomists and whatnot. And to say there are numerous ways that people have approached this. It's not as unified. And I'm not saying that massive deviations. I am saying development. And that's actually a compliment. I was talking yesterday, Dr. Feingold, we were talking about certain ideas regarding church authority over long periods of time, all the way back to the beginning of the church, and saying that, how is the Pope, the authority of the Pope, and the way that the Pope has spoken about those beneath him, the way that the saints have talked about obedience and humility, even in disagreement, even when they think that something's bad or wrong or outright evil. And the idea of that was that, yes, that would be big T tradition if you have development. And just so you know, and I won't reveal my hands too quickly, I believe that there is development, and I believe I at least know of the development in one case, one very pivotal one that is at the heart. In fact, even the encyclical itself is at the heart of a particular controversy that's resulted in certain dynamics of the Recognize and Resist movement. But it's a bummer that we even need to talk about it in this way, but it does show the profound impact, the triumph, in fact, of the angelic doctor. And that's, and so to say, it's one thing to go, well, I wish that it weren't in such a way that we've got to deal, for example, with Gilson in 1959, saying that the long and short of it, this is a quote, the long and short of it is simply that in matters of theology, one cannot be right against St. Thomas Aquinas. I know a lot of people who don't agree with that. I know a bunch of folks who go, look, are you the best? Can you be the best at something and yet not be perfect? Can you be the best at something, at synthesizing, and yet recognize powerful developments or places where maybe that synthesis didn't synthesize enough things? Maybe there were even aspects of it that needed to be brought in. There's all different ways you can do that without showing disrespect. But this article by Brendan Case, we'll start here. He says, Aquinas was an enthusiastic Aristotelian. Bonaventure also knew Aristotle well, and everywhere draws on him respectfully and creatively. Nonetheless, he was a purer Augustinian than Aquinas, and rejected not only the radical views at the time that had to do with Aquinas, or not Aquinas, with Aristotle, but also Aquinas' more moderate Aristotelian empiricism. For instance, Bonaventure expressly denies that the mind is a blank slate. That's one of those things that I've criticized, right? And I have to give credit where it's due. Dr. Jared Goff, he posted a comment quite a while back, early on when I was talking about presuppositionalism, and he said, Bonaventure's your man. And he gave me a number of books, and I've bought a number of them already. Although, I got to tell you, the book on the questions regarding the knowledge of Christ, that book, man, you try to find that thing. I found like one copy at this haunted bookstore or something or other. Some dude selling it for like $25. All the other copies I saw were like $100-something. Said, oh my gosh, but I bought a bunch of them. And in doing so, I was blown away because I've been critical of the blank slate for a long time. I've talked about it on the show. One asks whether all knowledge, this is a quote, one asks whether all knowledge is from the senses. You hear this all the time, right? You hear this idea that all knowledge comes through the senses, and I've been critical of this. Bonaventure says, we must say that it is not. Why? For the soul knows God and itself, and whatever is within it without the assistance of the exterior senses. So he's going back and is like, there are certain things that we can say, yeah, we're not knowing those things because of the senses. We do in fact know this. And what do we know? God, our soul does, and itself, and whatever is within it. And it does this, it knows this, without the assistance of the exterior senses. Consequently, he also defended St. Augustine that we do indeed, quote, perceive by a pure intuition that God exists. This is often called Augustine's theory of divine illumination. He also agreed, of course, with Anselm that we do indeed prove it a priori. That's controversial, by the way. But that's also what we're doing on the show. That's why I think it's at least fair, right? It's an admission that it's controversial. I'm not walking in going, oh yeah, this isn't controversial. This is like not, this is going to be accepted by everybody. Why do you think I use the idea that the imagery of the icebreaker, that boat crashing through the ice? Why do you think I talk that way? Because I recognize what this is. I recognize the uphill battle. I'm going uphill both ways. I'm doing my darndest, right? You know me. You know me. That's just how I roll. But the fact is, you got to be realistic. You got to admit what you're up against. If you don't, you're not going to be able. If you can't ascertain the situation as it is, how are you possibly going to make real progress without it just being like, incidentally, you did so? Well, what amazing coincidence you made progress. You didn't really understand the layout of the land or anything or what you're up against. You kind of underestimated or overestimated your position and your place. And it worked out okay. Wow, what an amazing thing. The more you do that, the closer it gets to just saying, it's just a miracle. It's just a Hail Mary. I'm trying my best to not do that. Okay? Bonaventure beautifully linked these two concerns in his 5th chapter of his master work, Mind's Journey to God. Bonaventure insists that what first falls, and this is a quote, we've mentioned this before, and it will not be the first time or the last time that this gets said. Okay? Right here. Let me find it. Okay. What first falls, quote, what first falls in the intellect is the divine being, end quote. That is illuminationism. Okay? So the first thing that falls into the intellect, the very first, from the get-go, early on, is going to be illumination, divine being. Bonaventure begins this discussion by exploring the implications of naming God who is, right? The tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton. So you say, people, YHVH, okay? So the tetragrammaton, the unspeakable 4-letter name. And he sees in this the infinite fullness and perfection which is presupposed to the knowledge of any and every finite reality. So he sees in this, in God being the who is, the I am that I am, right? He sees in that something that in fact must be presupposed. He sees in it the infinite fullness and perfection which is presupposed to the knowledge of any and every finite reality. The intellect, he argues, first knows being, which is identical with God. He says this, so being is what falls first into the intellect, and that being which is pure act. But this is not a particular being, which is restricted being, because that's mixed with potency, nor analogous being, because that has actuality in the minimal degree, since it minimally exists. And so it remains that being, which falls first into the intellect, is the divine being. So he's saying there are certain reasons why you would not be able to contend, or it would be extremely problematic to contend that the being that falls first into the mind, that it's particular. right? Because that would be restricted. Because that's mixed with potency. And it's not analogous either. Because that would have actuality in the minimal degree. Because it would minimally exist. Now, first, the most fundamental object of our knowledge, in this case, is always being. For example, and you may have heard this before, okay? If I see someone approaching from a great distance, I first simply observe that there's something coming. Being falls first into the intellect, and only later that it's a living thing, a human, and finally, my friend, William. You may have heard this from Aquinas when talking about God. So far, Bonaventure and Aquinas are on the same page. Aquinas puts it this way, quote, our intellect naturally knows the existent. He later specifies that as the universal existent. Okay. Ens is the present participle of the verb esse, being as opposed to the uninflected to be. But here's where it gets a little bit mixed up. Here's where things start getting spicy between them. Bonaventure's second premise specifies that the first object of our intellect must be pure act, rather than restricted or analogous being. And analogous being, happening to be the latter being, is the equivalent of Aquinas' universal existent. So what is analogous being? All right, so he's saying it's not analogous, it's pure act. Pure act. It's not analogous. But what is analogous? What do you mean by that? Analogous being is being insofar as it is predicated analogously of each of Aristotelian categories. Right? A cat exists, for example, a cat exists in one way, okay? The blackness of its fur exists in another way. The sharpness of its claws exists in another way, and you could go on and on and on. This priority of pure act in our knowledge follows from an intuitive account of actuality as that which we must first understand in order to understand potency. Now, these might be a little bit fancy terms, right? But think about it, right? The idea of potency, right? Your potential. You say you have to have some actuality first. You have to. For example, I can only be potentially sitting down, or I can only potentially be ending the show if, in fact, I have actually started the show. Right? Or at least in some other state. So if you can potentially finish the race if you are in another state, which is not the finish of the race. Okay? So to our knowledge of imperfect, limited realities cannot be logically prior to our knowledge of perfect, unrestricted being. And he says it this way. He says, we have ideas about privations or defects, stuff that's lacking, stuff that's missing, stuff that's messed up and broken, disordered. He says that this can only be known through positive attributes. How could the intellect know that this or that being is defective and incomplete if it had no knowledge of a being without any defect? It's a good question. That's his position. And he believes that you have that knowledge from, in fact, the get-go. That it's the first thing. There's nothing that precedes that knowledge of pure act. That knowledge of being, and that being, God. Notice, however, Bonaventure's position expressly denies, and this is important, it expressly denies that God is the mind's first explicit object. So the idea between explicit and implicit. And there's a good reason for this. Obviously, right? There's a good reason for this. And he's going to explain it. While affirming that we are always, in some sense, already acquainted with God in all of our acts of knowing. So in every act of knowing, for Bonaventure, we are in some way acquainted with God. And just so you know, if there's nothing else in this dynamic of Catholic presuppositionalism, in this dynamic of my brand of it, a lot of people, you're getting that from Bonson. You're getting that from Van Til. They said that about the whole thing. They don't know anything about how it was used in Catholic controversy. They don't know how it was used in St. Irenaeus. They don't know how it was used, arguably, even by St. John of Damascus or by St. Athanasius. They're not even addressing that at all. But when it comes to this particular issue, I'm always being accused all the time as if it's the first time that any Catholic person has said such a thing. Incorrect. Unfair. Incorrect. I'll stick with incorrect. And we have to be, in this way, we're already acquainted with God in all of our acts of knowing, just as some acquaintance with light is presupposed to, even if not explicitly thematized, in every act of vision. So every act of vision that you have, light is presupposed. There's light there, okay? If there was no light, you ain't seeing anything. Even if it's not thematized, and in fact, most of the time, and this is the clincher, most of the time, it's not. How often do you look around and you are bedazzled by the blue drapes or the brown walls or the green walls or, by stickers and posters or cars or ice cream cones? What you're seeing on TV, you're bedazzled by that. Even by the screen you're looking at right now, bedazzled maybe by your boy. It's at least possible, right? Come on now. You may be bedazzled by the cool colors, the LUT, right? The color grading that's done and the lighting scheme that's done. It's pretty decent today. Not looking too bad, not too shabby. And you may not even realize, just take a moment and look around you just for a moment and look around to see where your light sources are, including everything you're seeing on the screen. You're seeing a digital representation of me on the screen. That screen is created. There's multiple lights at play here, right? There's multiple things pumping out light at you. That's why you can turn it up and turn it down. I'll turn it down. I don't know if it changes the color on my face. But you can turn it up and down on your screen. It's got a little thing there for the brightness. Same thing with my camera. My camera, in fact, requires light. That's one of the main things that when people make videos for the first time, that they don't really take into consideration at all. You'll see a lot of times where people, the way that they have it set up, okay, the way that they have it set up is that the light, they don't even think of where to place it. And it's beaming on their face. Huge amounts of exposure, just all over. It looks like the sun on their face, right? Because they've got all these oils on their face. And that camera is searching for light. Otherwise, it's going to get real grainy. And there's things you can do to try to get the perfect amount of light you need and whatnot. But most of the time, that's one of the main things that people don't think about. It's in time after time after time, light. And the way that I create this is light. This right here, even this is motivated lighting, this lamp over here, okay? That light is not actually creating anything on my face. You may have seen it in my glasses before. I've got an umbrella light, I've got a key light, I've got a ring light, I've got 3 lights behind me for backlighting, which you might see right here and even on the back of my neck. Should be here, but it's not. But I've learned these techniques. But yet, so much of that is what creates the spectacle. And yet, how often do you say, dude, I really dig that lighting, or appreciate the influence and impact and awareness, in fact, that subtle awareness that you have of light. And in fact, that it would be necessary for you to see any of this at all. Which is why he can say this, quote, "Remarkable is the blindness of the intellect, which does not consider that which is known first, and without which it can know nothing. If you did not have this, you could know nothing. But as the eye, intent on various differences of colors, does not see the light by which it sees other things, or if it sees, does not notice it, so too the eye of our mind, intent on particular and universal beings, nonetheless does not notice being itself, beyond every genus, although it occurs first to the mind. Powerful point, by the way. It's ever present, always there, only made possible because of that. His point is that we cannot help, in fact, but be acquainted with the reality of God, who is the uninflected to be, from which every particular borrows its being, even if we subsume that infinite reality under any number of mistaken descriptions. So, this is where we get in the world where you can say people can still live and move and have their being, remarkably so. It's a God thing, actually. In a world, right, that declares the glory of God in all things, you can't hide from it. There's nowhere. Where are you going to run? What are you going to do? Even your thoughts, as we'll point out. You can't even think it. You can't even speak it without playing the part of the fool, right? And yet at the same time, you can mistake it. You can mistake the descriptions. You can mistake the cause, which is at the root of a whole bunch of espoused worldviews, beliefs that people claim, which is where we get in the thicket. When you have people, who say, well, why couldn't you just presuppose nihilism? Or why couldn't you just presuppose Judaism or Islam or Mormonism? Why couldn't you just do that? You can see they know a lot of stuff, right? They know a whole bunch. So what's the problem? Because they're wrongly seeing the reality of the very first thing, the being, the Trinitarian God that makes any knowledge of particulars possible. He goes further, of course, says this is that idea of connecting in that way is how we're able with certainty to talk about universals. Otherwise, we'd be left with the lack of certainty and the skepticism that comes from only knowing particulars within the domain of our very, very limited lives. Even if we were to combine that with a bunch of other people, so what? You'd be left with some serious issues. That's not to take away the idea that you, in fact, do know things in one way by particulars, right? And that you're able to see and recognize that. He's saying that he emphasizes the recognize that, not discover, to recognize. We find a more expansive treatment of the mind's pre-theoretical acquaintance with the Lord. And I like how he does the all caps for that, right? Because he didn't have to with the Tetragrammaton. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. In the long fourth question of the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ, which asks, quote, whether whatever is known by us with certainty is known in the eternal principles, the rationes aeternae. The ratio aeterna is Bonaventure's favorite expression for the divine ideas. The exemplars subsisting in the divine intellect, in and through which God knows and creates. Okay, and the idea of that ratio, right? Depending on the context, it could be reason, nature, account, principle, or aspect, right? All of those things are he says, are good English equivalents of that. Bonaventure distinguishes among three possible ways of affirming this proposition. So he says, okay, there's three ways of doing it. Number one, that we only know divine ideas. Hopefully, red flag goes up. Hopefully, red flag goes up for like a bazillion reasons, right? But a real big one. Second, the divine ideas are the ultimate cause, but not the object of our knowledge. Third, that we know the divine ideas confusedly and indistinctly in and through our knowledge of particular beings. Strikingly, the same threefold scheme appears both in Aquinas' discussion of the abstracting intellect, that's in his commentary on the sentences, and in the somewhat later exposition on the Trinity of Boethius. In the later work, okay, so in dealing with the first proposition, so you have strikingly, you have a similar layout, right, of the way that this works. And you'll see he'll break down the differences because they're not just saying the same thing. Okay? That's why there's a big difference. The first position was, so to speak, too hot. Because, why? Because it assimilates all knowledge to the beatific vision. Yeah, that would, that'd be all knowledge. Your knowledge of kitty litter would be that. You'd be real tough, man. It'd be not good. That'd be real bad. So that's an obvious problem. And like we do on the show, right? We follow him in this way. He insists that any account at all of human knowledge must keep our acquaintance with creatures at the center. We talk about it here. What do we call it? Do you remember? We call it the creator-creature distinction. Yeah. Yeah, so we emphasize that. Because otherwise, you diminish that, you're in wicked land, man. We're talking like getting pantheism. We're talking, entering into some weird heretical hellscapes. Bad. The second approach, though, okay? And the second approach, remember, is that the divine ideas are the ultimate cause, but not the object of our knowledge. That might actually sound similar, not only to Thomism, but to the things that I'd been saying, in fact. Right? Its way of influence, so that the knower in knowing does not attain to eternal reason. So this would be according to Bonaventure, he thought that this position was too cold. Okay, he thought that it was a kind of Aristotelian naturalism, something that he was definitely not a fan of. And he said, to which, quote, the eternal reasons that are that necessarily contributes to certain knowledge by way of its influence, so that the knower in knowing does not attain to the eternal reason, but to only its influence. So he's saying that, you may have the necessary precondition. It's simply the cornerstone. It's simply a missing piece of the puzzle. It's only saying, well, I have need of the hypothesis. That's all. But that you don't attain to the eternal reasons, but only to the influence of those things. He thought, that influence, by the way, in view here, is at least analogous to the position maintained by Aquinas, nicely summarized in his exposition on the Trinity. He writes this: the human mind is divinely illumined by a natural light. According to the Psalm, the light of your face is sealed upon us, Lord, insofar as, quote, it has in itself the means for making things actually intelligible, namely the agent intellect, i.e., the mind's form minor. He says, he puts it more clearly in the Summa. He says, quote, Aquinas, we must say that the human intellect knows all things in the eternal reasons, by participation in which we know all things. For the intellectual light which is in us is nothing other than a certain participated likeness of the uncreated light, in which the eternal reasons are contained. It would have been more accurate in his mind, Brendan Kay's. He said it would have been more accurate of Aquinas to say that on his view, we know all things, not in the eternal reasons themselves, but rather in a created likeness of those reasons. You hear this sometimes, don't you? In conversations with people, Eastern Orthodox apologists. Have you ever heard this? Right? Where it's all just, everything is the created likeness. There's no connection, right, to the actual divine act. And it's interesting he talks about the divine act because so much of that debate actually revolves around essence and energies and things like that when debating with people in the East. Bonaventure has two objections to this. Evaluate for yourself. First, he says that this fails as an interpretation of Augustine, who was insisting, quote, that the mind in certain cognition has to be regulated by immutable and eternal rules, not as through the habit of his mind. Okay, so Augustine's saying not through the habit of his mind, these eternal rules, like it's just kind of, it's a missing piece of the puzzle. That's it. But as through those things which are above him in the eternal truth. Part of this you will find is that it plays in, again, to salvaging to that connection that I said is important. And this is a fusion. This isn't an either or. This transcends, right? This transcends the idea of pitting against each other, the idea of, that we know these things only in a strictly analogous way, that they reflect the reality of this, okay? And on the other hand, that it's coherent. So you have your coherentist view, right? And these things are often just pitted against each other all the time, as if they're mutually exclusive ideas. And what he would be saying would be, on the one hand, yes, we would know those things in a way that'd be object by object by object, and we would know them in a way that's analogous with the way that God knows. But where is that connection? And that connection is with the divine, because the divine would have the coherent understanding of all things in and of themselves. You wouldn't be left with narrative structures and crossing your fingers, throwing up a Hail Mary, hoping you're good. I don't want to overstate that case either, but I'm saying this is the context of this. Okay? Yeah, so correspondence and coherence. That one thing corresponds, and the alternative of that is coherence. And saying, in this position, you maintain both. You maintain both. On the one hand, you're able to correspond. On the other hand, how do you know it corresponds to the mind of God? Where are you getting this? Are you just winging it? So he says it fails in the interpretation of Augustine, right? Bonaventure, in fact, is right to see a deep continuity between his and Augustine's theories of knowledge. You've got numerous documents, right, from Augustine. You got on the teacher, on true religion, on freedom of the will, on the Trinity, on the city of God. And by the way, you can find those over at Catholic Encyclopedia, New Advent. You can read a whole bunch of stuff. I have a bunch of bookmarks of that in my bookmark folder, right? Bookmark manager. I go on there and it's loaded. I mean, completely loaded. I'm also buying a bunch, not so much ones that I can read on Catholic Encyclopedia, but ones that I can, and you can download Catholic Encyclopedia, so you can download this stuff. But also, I bought a whole bunch of books today. Bought probably about $180 to $200 worth of books. We read a lot on the show. Okay. But in these, all these books, example after example after example, and there's you can go and say newadvent.org. He puts it in there so you can go read it for yourself to see where he would say these things. But as an example, quote, "We behold then by the sight of the mind in that eternal truth from which all things temporal are made, the form according to which we are, and according to which we do anything by true and right reason, either in ourselves or in things corporeal." The second reason, because that's he's just adding to the situation, adding to it, saying, look, this is what he's talking about. The second reason that Bonaventure had for disagreeing with what was said in the Summa is that if God's role in human knowing occurs only at the level of our disposition to formulate reason's first principles, okay, and now we're back to the question of first principles. That's all it is. Oh yeah, we're driven in such a way that we're just trying to find the first principles. He says if that's all it is, then, quote, God can no more be called the giver of wisdom than the fertilizer of the earth, nor should knowledge be said to come from him more so than wealth. And how would it be contained within the Lord? How would it be contained, the fullness of those things, contained in that way? But to say, look, If you take it away, and all it is you're striving for first principles, and from there, in a way, at least, and maybe, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems as though Bonaventure, it seems as if there was almost this suspicion that there was kind of its own version, right, moderated version of the watchmaker with knowledge. It drives us to the first principle, right, the starting point, the foundation of those things. I suspect that Bonaventure was responding to a comment from Aquinas' Sentences commentary. Quote, as every natural work is in God, as in the one containing it, including walking and the like, so also the knowledge of the truth is in the Holy Spirit, who works in the intellect and conserves it. For Bonaventure, too, all natural powers are supernatural. I've said this, I've talked before about this and said, look, when talking about natural reason, when talking about nature in general, you say, look, the idea when we talk about nature and when an atheist is talking about nature, we're not really talking about the exact same thing. We aren't. Unless it's just, well, these are, that there's no connection at all, right? That it's just simply purely naturalistic, just material. that there's nothing about that that's in any way different in the way that we understand these things. And in that sense of contingently receiving their being and structure from God. But the mystery of intellect constitutes a distinct spring through which supernature permeates nature. For him, as for David Bentley Hart, quote, we can approach nature only across the interval of the supernatural. We're ensouled. We're ensouled creatures. It's this kind of thing that we can't get around that. We can't get around that. When we talk about people, we're not just talking atoms, right? Maybe that would be a better example to use. See, when you're talking about people, we're not just talking about, well, it's just just bunch of atoms flying all over the place. Stardust, that's it. And yeah, Sam says this is especially true when regarding miracles. The atheists and theists have different ideas of what a miracle is. Of course. Bonaventure instead seeks a middle way between this nothing but God illuminationism, right? That says that you would only know those things, all you see is God, that you're seeing into the beatific vision sort of thing, right? Or what I've joked about before, that everything you see in that moment, you only know because of the zoinks in the brain. God's downloading the information, which would lead to all sorts of problems too, because all these different people have different ideas about what they know. Is God zoinking that in everybody's brain? Maybe I need to drop zoink, but I kind of like it. I hope you know what I mean by that. Kind of that idea, like if you could just imagine, like, okay, I got it. Like the show Chuck, you remember that? Where he's the intersect, and every time he kind of has his eyes get all funky, and then he's like, yeah, I know Kung Fu now. Or he knows the secret code, or how to jump through laser beams. Or like on Psych, where, he's sitting there and he has that idea, he sees something, he puts it together, and real quick, puts his hand up, he's like, oh yeah, that mystical kind of thing. But on Bonaventure's view, that middle way view, on this view, quote, certain knowledge necessarily requires an eternal principle to regulate it and to serve as its moving principle. Not indeed as alone in all of its brightness, but along with the created principle, the ratio, and particularly seen together with contuita. Right? That it's by us. It's partly seen together with it by us. So in contuita, right? That we are able to see this sort of thing, that there's a connection between those in ratio and in contuita. This is why he says that God's being is contuita. And I don't know if I'm, again, I apologize. I apologize if I'm pronouncing any of these things incorrectly. The proper object of human knowing remains the creature, but the light which irradiates it shines forth from that creature's infinite source, which is known in and through our act of knowing the particular. Bonaventure takes it that we can only know necessary truths in particular, along with creatures themselves, right? That we can only know these if we also contuit the eternal archetypes which they express. Quote, things exist in their own genus, and also in the mind and in the internal principle, but their being is not entirely immutable in the first and second modes, but only in the third, namely as they exist in the eternal word. And so it remains that nothing can make things to be perfectly intelligible unless Christ is present, the Son of God and our teacher. Yeah. And so we'd have to have some kind of a connection with that, to where something that would be immutable. They mention, by the way, they talk about the triangle's interior angles, the sum to 180 degrees. It says this knowledge cannot arise from the inked paper that composes a particular instance of a triangle, since its sides can only approximate the rational relations in which triangularity consists, and its existence is a passing vapor compared with the eternal necessity which shines through it. What then does one know in knowing a triangle as a triangle, if not a distant echo or a pale reflection of what the Father knows in knowing triangularity as one of the words which subsist in his word? That we talk about thinking God's thoughts after him. I use this same kind of logic when talking about speaking of the church as the church speaks of herself. And both of those I'm using a kind of hermeneutic, an epistemology that's saying, what I know of the church and what the church says of herself is through what the church says, in fact, of herself. I can know many other things, but I know them most certainly in that way. I know them most truly in that way, because I could be wrong, but the church cannot, but I can. That's like the closest approximation that I have to this, to say, in that way, if we know these things as God knows those things, but how would that happen? And if we couldn't, how do we, other than simply putting together some kind of a coherentist narrative structure, right? That says, you've got a narrative, you've got a story, it's got bits and pieces over here of what reality is like in multiple ways, and it's a coherent tale, but you don't know if those things are truly being reflective of the whole. You have to be able to connect with something, or in this case, someone, in fact, who knows the whole. And the whole as it truly is, from beginning to end, through and through, all the way down. That's God. And even then, we're still limited. Now, Aquinas is not necessarily the happiest about this. Aquinas criticizes the nothing but God illuminationism. However, Bonaventure also rejects this, sketches a weaker position, Aquinas does, which is strikingly similar, in fact, to Bonaventure's own. Quote, others said, this is Aquinas, that the divine essence is not the first thing known by us who are on the way, but rather the influence of its light. And in this respect, God is the first thing which is known by us. However, Aquinas seems to think that this position commits us to saying that explicit knowledge of God is the first object of the intellect. So his answer in talking about this, again, seems strikingly reminiscent of Bonaventure. He says, for that in which we know all things, and through which we judge all the things we know. So in the way that we know all things, the way that we judge the things that we know, in that way is the first thing known by us. Just as the light is known by the eye, prior to those things which are seen through the light. And the intellect's principles are known prior to its conclusions. That's interesting. But all things are known in the first truth, and through it we judge all things. As Augustine says in his On the Trinity and on True Religion, therefore the first truth, namely God, is that which is first known by us. Yeah. Now he explains, of course, how we can have God as the first known implicitly and yet not adverted to explicitly with the same simile. They use the same simile about the eye and various colors, but this is what he did with it. This is what he did with it. He says, as the eye, intent on various differences of colors, does not see the light by which it sees other things, or if it sees, does not notice it, so too the eye of our mind. So again, you've got these similarities, but where's the difference? Aquinas' response to this objection strengthens the illusion further. What did he do? What did Aquinas do to strengthen the illusion further? He first proposes implausibly, okay? Daring statement. I'm sure there'll be a couple folks who are not the happiest about that claim. Implausibly, that for Augustine, quote, uncreated truth itself is not the proximate principle by which we know and judge. But we say it is, because we know and judge through the light which is impressed upon us and which is its likeness. Yeah. The only problem with this is immediately following this, he then tries to explode the light analogy in a way that makes his concern with Bonaventure really clear. Because so far you're like, well, what's the deal then? What's the deal? It doesn't, I'm hearing, it sounds like you just said the same thing again, Jeremiah. What's the deal? Thomas, quote, nor, however, is it necessary that the very light which is impressed on us be the first thing known by us. It needn't be known, except in the knowables themselves, just as light needn't be seen first by the eye, except in illuminated color. Okay. Now hold on a second. Hold on a second. What's the problem? This is precisely as Bonaventure's analogy in reverse. He said it's not the light that we see first, so that the color may be seen. Rather, the color is seen first, and the light only by way of the color. So you see what he had to do. You see what he had to do to use that same analogy to say, to admit, yep, this is the way it works, but you don't know it. You don't know the light. You only see the light through the color. Well, how are you seeing the color? How are you seeing the color? It says, but Aquinas is only able to rebut Bonaventure's illuminationism by misconstruing it. Bonaventure does not maintain that God is known first with any clarity or distinctness. Here below, we see only through a glass darkly. Nonetheless, Bonaventure stands firmly within that long Platonist tradition in insisting that timeless truths must refer to a timeless order, which undergirds and so renders intelligible our experience of time's ceaseless flux. If time is constantly in flux, if there's constant movement and motion, things are changing. It may not look like it, but if I sit here, you don't even know the remarkable number of things in not only on me, in small parts of me that have moved, shifted, changed, that over time, that's the imperceptibility of these things even, but it's constantly moving. We know it in big ways when it comes to the sun and the moon. We know it in big ways when it comes to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We know these things. These things change. We know it. When I smile, I can see time right there. I have those lines. I've been smiling a lot, actually. I wear those things with pride. Yeah, John Denver's a little bit right. It's a little sexy growing old, to be frank, right? It's kind of nice, you know. I'll say that for a little bit. I'll say it for a little bit. It ain't gonna last forever, though. The problem here, getting back to the other side, sorry. We're in this ceaseless flux. So how are we able to connect with something that is not just in this ceaseless flux all the time, that gives it a permanence, a continuity? How is that? Bonaventure had an answer. Bonaventure connects his illuminationism directly with Anselm's a priori proof of God's existence. And this is where we get into the question about can an unbeliever, in fact, claim that they don't believe in God. And this is Anselm's a priori proof. If God names primary, eternal, simplest, most actual, most perfect being, it is impossible for him to be thought not to be. It'd also be impossible to be except one alone. So he would need to be one primary, eternal, simplest, most actual, most perfect being. Why does recognizing God as most actual and most perfect, why does that actually require us to deny the possibility of thinking him not to exist? Why is that? Just because he's the most perfect, you know, and you'll hear this. I mean, this is a common thing. You know, you're seeing kind of a renaissance a little bit, you know, of the ontological argument, what's called the ontological argument. There's actually more than one. Norman Malcolm rightly distinguished two of them. But it says here that the first of Bonaventure's disputed questions on the mystery of the Trinity offers an extensive defense of Anselm's ontological argument, which compares favorably with Aquinas' dismissive reading of Anselm. And one of the things to point out, again, is Malcolm distinguishes these things as follows, the two proofs. Anselm's first proof, okay, uses the principle that a thing is greater if it exists than if it doesn't exist, right? So when people say, it'd be better if I didn't exist, that's actually not true. Like, it's wrong. You'd be able to deal with them, right? You'd be able to deal with them in a way that goes, well, that's, you know, you actually need to go back and read a little bit of Anselm here, okay? Thing is greater if it necessarily exists than if it does not necessarily exist, okay? So the first proof uses the principle that a thing is greater if it exists than if it does not. His second proof employs a different principle, that a thing is greater if it necessarily exists than if it does not necessarily exist. Bonaventure and Aquinas both seem to have implicitly distinguished Anselm's proof along the lines, in fact, that Malcolm suggested. Each of them consider both proofs as separate arguments, in fact, for God's existence. They're geniuses, right? Total geniuses here. So of course they did. Would you have been able to? I don't want to say I would. Oh yeah, man, I would have spotted that. I don't think so. The problem comes up because to the extent that anyone today knows about this, it's been muddied. It's muddied all over the place. And they really only know the first formulation of it. It's the only version that's criticized by Thomas in the Summa. And it begins from the premise, quote, what exists in the intellect and in the actual world is greater than what exists only, right, in the intellect. Later on, you have Descartes, right? He ends up using a variation, in fact, of that argument, right? And he says that with the consequence that it alone has come to represent the ontological argument in the minds of a lot of people, including people who are against it. And in the case that Brendan Case is talking about, that would involve Immanuel Kant. Case, though, he wants to talk about Bonaventure's defense of the second one, okay? And if you remember, the second one is from the premise that perfect being includes necessary existence. So it's not just it is possible, but that it's necessary. That would be even more perfect, that would maximalize, which is more directly relevant, in fact, to the argument that Bonaventure is making in the Itinerarium, that we all immediately and necessarily intuit God's existence. So when he's making his argument, like we're making ours, like I'm making mine, and you may be making it with me, hopefully, that it is immediate and that it's necessary, that is a necessary precondition. That's the phrase that I use. Now going back on the first disputed question on the mystery of the Trinity, what does Bonaventure say? How does he play this in to his view of this? Quote, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. But what is such that it cannot be thought not to be? More truly is than what cannot be thought not to be. So what's greater than you can't even think that it wouldn't be. You can't even imagine that it wouldn't be. You could not say that it wouldn't be. That would be maximally necessary. And in his position, maximally great. Therefore, if God is that which nothing greater can be thought, then God cannot be thought not to be. Yeah. Now, you got in the Summa Contra Gentile, Aquinas has a second formulation of the argument along similar lines. He says, something greater than God could be thought if he could be thought not to be. So, maybe in a smoother way. It's similar, right? Right? Same lines. Both of these arguments descend from Anselm's second proof. And the key idea in that second proof is that necessary existence is a distinctive sort of great making property. So, like I just said, if it's necessary, that's a different kind of greatness. It's distinct. It belongs necessarily to the greatest possible being. That's the greatest. That would be his position. Whose existence thus is either impossible or necessary. And so it's either got to be impossible or it's got to be necessary in this way. The idea that necessary or unconditioned existence is a perfection is in fact intuitive. He uses an example. He says, fragile dishes depend on gentle handling, and otherwise identical but unbreakable objects would be greater dishes. So you're maximizing it. You're maximizing this. Bonaventure. If you take progressive abstraction along these lines, right? You're just abstracting, you're just going down the line. We can have this idea of a being whose existence is absolutely, all the way, absolutely, entirely unconditioned, depending on nothing outside of itself in any respect. Such a being would be, in fact, most perfect. More than that, it'd be most actual, most perfect, most actual. Since anything which has a mixture of potency, right? So it's not most perfect, it's not most actual, it's a mixture of potency, is necessarily dependent. We are a mix of potency. We are dependent. Right? We are dependent on food, on air, on a whole mix of things. I am not necessary. It's by the grace of God. It's by the design and plan of the one who conditions all things. I am conditioned by many things. So I would be dependent. You would be dependent. It's included even in the language we use for our children. They're dependent. Not only were we dependent on something outside of ourselves for our existence, but that's true forever and ever and ever. Every kid that's born, in fact, it's funny, isn't it? We call them dependents. And we say, you've got a lot of potential, Junior. You got a lot of potential. And your teacher might say it for a different reason than the dad. And if such a being, in fact, is possible, it necessarily exists, since by definition, its existence depends on nothing other than itself. Yeah, Sam, in the comments, is God so great that he cannot be claimed to not exist because the nature of who God is? This is what we're getting to. Yeah, so I mean, you're already in this way, if he's unconditioned by anything and not dependent on anything, if he's the maximal amount of this, then in that way it would be necessary, because you would not have anything, he wouldn't be dependent on anything. He's necessary. And in fact, it's necessary for us because we're contingent. Because we have potentials, mixed potential, in fact. We are not most actual. We are not most perfect. I might say that to my wife, but deep down inside, I know she's not the Lord. Right? Bonaventure considers an objection to this argument. So he says, okay, in good scholastic fashion, how the objector wonders, can you say, and this is it right here, Sam. Good timing, brother man. How the objector wonders, can you say that God's non-existence cannot be thought? It's obvious that I can assert his non-existence. So it's obvious, Bonaventure's like, look, so how is it possible that I can't even think that? I mean, obviously I do. Are you familiar with this? Have you heard this kind of thing before? When you bring up morals or something and you say, well, are you saying I can't know anything? Are you telling me I can't do good? I mean, obviously I can. And they can point to a number of things they may do, but they're missing the point, right? He says, obviously, I can assert that God doesn't exist. And if you say that those assertions are false, then you're not saying anything more than can be said for all necessary truths, many of which are just plainly dubitable. So that's the objection. He's proposing an objection, right? Steel manning himself in this way and saying, look, obviously we can. And if you say that all those assertions are false, you're not saying anything different. I mean, that's true. You can say that for a lot of claims. That doesn't make those claims necessary or your position on those things necessary. Now, this nicely anticipates. So, I mean, don't you love this back and forth? Because you can sense, Bonaventure writing, and he anticipates Aquinas. They're playing. These guys are playing 4D chess for real, right? These dudes are bona fide geniuses, playing chess, making moves, listening, thinking it through. Imagine the kind of turmoil, thinking it through. Does he have me pinned down? And you can see the shifts and the little things they grant, the way that they're using similar ideas, reframing it maybe, doing that. And you can only imagine sometimes like, oh, he's ripping me off, sort of thing. But this nicely anticipates the objection that Aquinas would lodge against the argument in Summa Contra Gentiles. He insists this, quote, that God can be thought not to be. So to think that God doesn't exist comes not from the imperfection or the uncertainty of God's being, since God's being is most manifest in itself. Okay, so it's not an imperfection in itself, and it's most manifest, but rather from the weakness of our intellect, which cannot behold him in himself, but only from his effects. and so is led to know him by reasoning. That's common, isn't it? Isn't that the common refrain? That's what, look, that's it at the heart. So much of the debate over the controversy of Catholic presuppositionalism is, in fact, it's right there. It's not a new debate, by the way. Aquinas' candor is admirable. We cannot be immediately acquainted with God. That's his insistence. Because, of course, in parentheticals, as all good Aristotelians know, we can know only what is given to us in sensation. We know God only remotely by reasoning from his effects. So people say we can only know God by looking out at the effects. There's nothing more that we'd be able to know, and we can only know through the senses. I've talked a lot about this. I've talked a lot about what this would do, the difficulties that this would propose, that this would result in. I've used examples of otherwise brilliant dudes who go down a line in a discussion, a particular line of reasoning, and they get to the end, and it's supposed to be the coda, the brilliant moment, right? It's a cascading thing. It's just boom, right? Powerful thing. And they get there, and they're thrown into a place where they actually have to kind of fall back on intuition. What's your hunch? What do you think? Talking about universals. The fallacy of composition, for example. Bonaventure has a response, of course. And what is Bonaventure's response? It's not that we cannot form the thought that God does not exist. Of course we can. People do it all the time. They have the thought in their head. They say, yeah, I can think God doesn't exist. However, quote, this is mega dope. I have a big star next to it on my page. His existence is so self-evident in itself, and it is so certain for the knower, the person, the atheist person, anybody, all of us, anyone who knows. His existence is so evident in itself and so certain in itself to the knower that if he would rightly consider it, there is no way for its truth to be removed. For it is a truth most evident and most present, which is absent, meaning it's not, there's nowhere in the world, it's absent from no place, no time, no thought, which is not the case with other created truths. In fact, I wish I had time. I'm already at the hour and a half mark. You know, there's I wanted to print something out talking about Bonaventure and how he goes and he's using, and I don't think I printed it out though. It's a bummer. Where he's using other things to do with logic, particularly the principle of non-contradiction. So he's going into the idea of non-contradiction and how we say, well, that's self-evident. And he says, that's even more. He aligns it that way. And he says, because even that is conditioned by this. Everything that's known is conditioned by this. By the Lord. The reason that God cannot coherently be thought not to exist. That's why I love that he can't coherently, okay? It's going to fall apart. Why? Is that if God exists at all, if God does exist, he exists in such a way that his existence is totally unconditioned by anything else. So not relying on it, not conditioned by it, absolute, maximal, necessary, but conditions everything else. So nothing is outside the scope. You can't say he's like, I always joke about it. It's like a subtle thing within the apologetic where I say sometimes people are biting their nails like, oh man, like God's up in heaven. He's like, oh, I wish I would have known this. Oh no, this is going to really foil my plans. It's a joke. So in the end, what ends up happening is it is the uninflected to be, the uninflected being that we are all familiar with at the heart of every single statement, every thought with existential import. And so it accompanies every single thought. Even the thought that you've got in the chat by Aaron Fisher saying that God does not exist. I want you to pray, by the way, for Aaron Fisher. I don't want people bashing Aaron Fisher. I used to be an atheist for 7 years, homie. I wasn't just that. I had a special profile over on Secular Student Alliance. I was on the state board of Center for Inquiry, Michigan. I used to be buddies with the founder, right, of Real Atheology and Reasonable Doubts. And so it's one of these things that's like, look, I'm quite familiar with where you're coming from, bro. Pray for him, but know this actually about him. Know this about anyone who says this. Know this about yourself. Know it. That at the heart of every statement, including theirs, that has existential import. And because it has existential import, it accompanies every thought, even the thought that there is no God. For this reason, only the fool, in fact, can form his thought, because only a fool would contradict himself in the very act of speaking. It's one of those things. It's one of those things. And with the aim of this, only to say, and I'll end just simply to say, right, that Bonaventure, in this regard, gives us good reason to think that we do in fact perceive an immediate intuition that God exists, and also prove it a priori. There's a reason why we would be able to know these things, even to deny these things. I've talked about it before. In fact, I talk about it all the time. Using the Tractatus to say, you've got this idea that the unbeliever making all of these arguments and reaching up to this place and saying, we finally reached the place. I've used my reason. I've used everything else. And you get there and you find out it's all for naught. It's been the theater of the absurd, in fact. And kick it away. And yes, politically Catholic, we've already, I don't know if you just showed up in here. We're talking about Bonaventure. We're using the arguments. We just went through the back and forth between Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas. And I was saying that in the main, and it just by the way, the reason why, just to wrap it up, because I don't want to, if you want to go through and hear the play-by-play back and forth, for one, the article, it's an excellent read. Brendan Case over at Church Life Journal, McGrath Institute. But basically the idea was talking about what does it mean God's being or God's existence being the base of knowledge, and the difference that him and Aquinas had in that regard. Okay. But skipping to the end, his belief, his conclusion, Bonaventure's, and I stand with this, but I said the one that wrote the piece on Catholic presuppositionalism, a Reformed versus Catholic approaches, inspired in part by your boy here, that he's more Thomistic in the way that I am more Bonaventurian. And I'm grateful for these because I believe that there's a good reason to aspire to a synthesis of these things. And I think that it's fortunate for us that they worked, in fact, providential, in fact, that they're both angelic doctors in that sense. One, the seraphim, the other, angelic. Either way, seraphic, angelic. They're both real close to the approximation with the tetragrammaton, right? With the Lord. Holding a special place, informing each other, having that debate, fleshing it out, and you can see it develop. But for Bonaventure, the way he ended, and the way that the position I maintain, is this. He says, of course, you can think God doesn't exist. We compared it to light, of course, saying it's so evident that to see anything, to know anything, you would need the light, which Thomas, to a certain extent, would agree with. He uses the same idea of that. In fact, after Bonaventure did. But he says this, his existence is so evident in itself and certain for the knower that if you would rightly consider it, there's no way for its truth to be removed. For it would be a truth most evident and most present, which is absent from no place, no time, no thought, which is not the case with other created truths. And the reason why is because the being that we're talking about is pure act, according to Bonaventure. It's not mixed potencies. So, as I said, given the layout of the argument as it was put forward, that's the conclusion Bonaventure and myself come to. That is, in this essay, not the conclusion of the Thomist buddy of mine who has become convinced of presuppositionalism because of this apostolate, in large part, right? And he's writing his 32-page essay on it. Fantastic. The guy's a genius. His name's Colin. And it's also, just so you know, the qualifier earlier on was that neither Bonaventure nor myself nor any other, no other Catholic that I'm aware of that would embrace this idea, none of them would claim that it's explicit, but it's implicit and yet necessary. That it's necessary, in fact, to salvage the certainty that we have regarding anything that goes beyond what we can know through pure correspondence of individual isolated particulars. That we can assemble them, we can even network with other people to try to get a good idea of that, but we're definitely nowhere near the edge of the universe. We can simply say, the best I know with the lights I've got, but it'd be really tough without invoking divine faith, without having a connection in some way to the Augustinian idea of divine illumination. I mean, you can say that you think that Bonaventure and Jeremiah are conflating evident. Look, you have to make that case better than a blurb. I don't mean to be rude, politically Catholic. You got to do better than that, homie. You got to do better than that. And it's one of those things, like, if I went through, and as I said, I don't know when you popped in. I don't know how long you've been there. But if you just got in, do me a favor and at least follow the logic or read this article. Don't just... maybe you have. Maybe you're like, I went and I read the article and I came in and this is what I'm doing. I don't know. Maybe that's you. I don't know. But I'm not going to get wrapped up with you in here. I got too much to do. And it's one of these things that I've learned is, number one, it's part of the debate over this that's informative. I mean, you may be much closer. In fact, I'm guessing you are closer to this. That God is, no, if you're saying that God's just evident, that, if I piece everything together, I can come to the conclusion of I've constructed it and I think I got it now. If that's how you're rolling, yeah, I'm definitely not with you on that. To me, it's a both and, not an either or. But I say you can only know those things if, in fact, you have some mechanism by which to connect with the being, in fact, and that being God, right? That you would be able to connect with him who is the pre-interpreter of all things. Because he would know those things front to back, beginning to end, top to bottom, through and through, as they are. For us, we'd always be left at that place. We would always be left at the behest of the limitations that we have as mortals, looking at particular. And one example of this, why this is so bad, is, and I'm not going to say the guy's name. I'll end with this. I didn't want to say the dude's name, but he was on a show talking to, this lady who was asking him why sometimes when he talks, he's really mean about women. And his answer was, well, I've talked to a lot of women. And I thought to myself, he's like, oh, I know women. Trust me, I have talked to women. I know. And I'm thinking, dude, that's the dumbest junk in the grand scheme. We can all chuckle at that. What I'm saying is that same idea, the logic that we have that casts suspicion on that and skepticism on that claim is the same exact thing that I'm invoking here by saying, I don't care if you have experienced your Wilt Chamberlain. Maybe you've been hooking it up fat with a bunch of ladies. Doesn't matter to me. Maybe you've read all the magazines. Doesn't matter to me. Maybe you could be encyclopedic on this planet. Doesn't matter to me, because you're still stuck at this place where you're starting from here trying to extrapolate outward, and you are left at the border of that area. And you can say, well, I've reached there and this makes sense, and therefore I can then do the leap of faith. The problem with that is that because it's not connected in any way with coherence, right? Something is not connected in a way that can even assure you that what you think you've constructed by particulars is anything more than a coherentist narrative. That's a big whoop-de-doo. My narrative is it's coherent. You say, well, yeah, okay. So and like I always say, so it's a good fairy tale. It's a good story as you understand it. And that's the world we're in right now, whether we like it or not. I don't like it, but that's definitely the world that we're dealing with and the apologetic situation that we're confronting. And so, yes. So yeah, we'd have ourselves a healthy disagreement. We'd have ourselves a healthy disagreement, Home Slice. But you could help to inform it. I mean, if you just say it's just evident and it's presuppositional, maybe you take a position that says that you need a presupposition as kind of an influence, but nothing more. That's what Bonaventure thought was too cold. Maybe you take that position. That'd be more analogous to Aquinas anyways. I can probably even safely say that you're along that line. I want to finish here. I went longer than I anticipated. I hope you don't mind. And by the way, as of right now, today is the anniversary of my firstborn daughter, my firstborn child, Samantha Lee Bannister. Marks the anniversary of her death. She died at 12 years old. She was diagnosed with brain cancer, and she died today in 2016. And I just looked up at the clock and saw it. And I'm going to refrain from crying, because I can promise you right now that I'll have plenty of crying to do when I'm off the air. I don't need to do that now. So I shared this recently. Somebody shared it in the chat, and it was cool. It was really cool. And if you're not in the chat, I encourage you to go over there. I'll head over there for a little bit here today. Not too long, though. Okay? Because it's late. But there's this book. I don't even know where it is. Theological Studies. I'm not sure what let me show message and find out. Okay. I don't know exactly what book. I forget. I found it recently. But it says this. It talks about in ironic mode, Catholic novelist Shusaku Endo confessed that he remained Catholic because of his unshakable conviction that Catholicism is not a solo, but a symphony. Quote, "If I've trusted in Catholicism, it's because I find in it much more possibility than any other religion for presenting the full symphony of humanity," end quote. If this symphonic version or vision of truth bears any force, it means that we must use a logic other than the logic of contradictories to describe that symphony. And so it means that the historical record cannot simply be of progressives and conservatives. whether in the 13th century or in the wake of Vatican II. In fact, it is a full hermeneutics of tradition and not just history, of the communio sanctorum, both the communion of saints and the sharing in holy things, that summons us to read and think according to a logic of communion, wherein particular figures and texts bear within them distinctive and irreducible insights that, together, lead the faithful into wisdom. In other words, a fully Catholic vision of our historical tradition may not only permit, but even require the witness of both Aquinas and Bonaventure, and more. And we are thus bound to strive for models of complementary relation that may allow such contrary positions to engage, to seek the truth of things without pressing them prematurely into binary contradictories. In other words, we are bound to strive for a theology of tradition that is truly Catholic. All right, I'm heading on over right now. I'm going to be going over to the Wolfpack. As I said, not super long. Not super long. If you love the show, and I hope you do, hit me up. I'd love to connect with you, right? As I said, we're all a work in progress here. I'm up against the ropes, folks, doing my best. And I'm really grateful for those other minds that come in to contribute to this cause, to advance certain ideas. And look, you're going to get disagreements all the time. If you think that you are part of a faith that is just simply on these issues, one position, you haven't talked to a SCOTUS. You haven't talked. In fact, you haven't even talked to a Thomist. And we'll talk about that another time. All the different views, the competing views on Thomism, the way. Will the real Thomism please stand up? Because its advocates oftentimes talk about it triumphalistically. And for good reason. Because he's the angelic doctor. Because his ability to synthesize, right, the way that we understand, to make valid distinctions, unprecedented. The guy was just absolute bona fide genius. Nobody's denying that, right? But so is the doctor who was named after the seraphim, Bonaventure, bona fide genius, buddies in fact, rivals, charitable, but rivals nonetheless. And if you'd like to know more, by the way, if you'd like to be involved with this apostolate, if you'd like to be involved, if you have articles or essays, if you have videos that you would like to do, if you have a show you'd like to start, that sort of thing, you got to hit me up. You can do that right there, PaleocratDiaries@gmail.com. Or please, actually, I need to just take that out. Go to Telegram. I'm at Jeremiah Bannister, at the Wolfpack Chat. Link in the description below. Go to Patreon, all that. I'll see you in the Wolfpack Chat in just a moment. Till next time, never give up. Keep on smiling, and memento mori.
I wanted to make people dream bigger thoughts.